Connecticut Restaurant Association. Appreciate everyone kind of taking some time here this morning. Definitely think this is an important call for all of us and kind of where we're going with everything. So, before I kind of introduce Ryan, I definitely have some updates I want to provide everybody kind of where we've been. I don't think we've had a webinar now in 2 weeks from a CRA standpoint for this larger group to kind of give you guys some updates to kind of what's going on a federal level, and then also what's going on at a state level, and try to answer questions. As you guys know, like always, using the chat on the bottom bar of the screen, you can obviously ask questions. I think it's the easiest way with the number of people. We're expecting a little over 100 folks today. Using the chat, happy to try to get to all the questions that we can, obviously specific to Ryan's presentation, but even if there's some federal or state questions on guidelines or things you guys are looking for, I'll try to answer those as well as we go through it. So without further ado, I guess I'll just get started. I'll share my screen here for everybody. And hopefully that seemed to work. Nice little photo here at Tavern on State, mixing it up a little bit. All right. So a couple slides to kind of go through before we go into kind of the managing of COVID in the workplace, because I know that's been a topic for discussion, a lot of calls and questions I've received, and I think having Ryan on the call to kind of give from our legal counsel side to give some perspective and best practices from a state side and a federal side. So before we get into that, obviously you guys know our two speakers. All right, let's start here. So as I went and searched the internet and found two photos, I really want to discuss this today. I think it's extremely important for the group as we now are exactly 6 weeks into outdoor dining. We have just hit 2 weeks into indoor dining from those dates. We are still trending in the right direction without question. As Eve yesterday alluded to, we had the lowest percentage number of positive cases at 0.7% out of 21,000, over 21,000 tests. We also, hospitalizations is down below 100. We're, I think, at 98 as of today. So very good news. But at the same time, we still need to continue. And I know there's been a lot of questions about where we get to phase 3 or masks or everything else. But I use these two photos as a perfect example of what's kind of going on around us in states. So top right corner is that photo from the Ozarks back on Memorial Day weekend that our governor liked to retweet and others like to try to show in the news. The media trying to talk about, look at people, they're not following it. This is ridiculous. We need to go back. We need to try to shut things down more. The virus is just going to spread. So obviously everyone knows that photo. The bottom right photo was actually taken this past weekend in New Jersey. This was a bar, the Reef, if anyone's been there. This is a bar, as you can see. This photo was also retweeted by Governor Murphy, who's the governor of New Jersey. As you guys maybe know or don't know, obviously with the spikes in cases across the country that we're dealing with right now, it's important to understand that our governors are making decisions about their phases and moving to specific phases based on those spikes. And Governor Murphy yesterday pulled back his indoor dining plan. And indoor dining in New Jersey was supposed to start tomorrow. Unfortunately, he made a decision to what he called putting it on pause, which is very disturbing for a lot of the restaurants in New Jersey. My counterpart, Mary Lou Halverson, who I know very, very well, we've had some long conversations. She's obviously very frustrated because you guys as restaurants know, as you prepared to reopen your doors, they were told 48 hours that it wasn't going to happen. And the reason that Governor Murphy is cited as saying why he's putting it on pause, really have nothing to do with metrics. They're still trending in the right direction. New Jersey, like us, obviously we are doing the best job, as well as Rhode Island, but they're not having any crazy spikes. But his two reasons are, one, he's quoted as saying because of other spikes across the country, it's causing him concern. And two, what's going on with establishments in New Jersey not following the rules. That's why I use that photo on the bottom right and down there at the Reef. That happened over the weekend. There's also another video on Governor Murphy's Twitter of an indoor bar in Jersey City that someone panned around on their cell phone, showing over 200 people inside the bar, which are not supposed to be, and no one had masks on. You can see in the photo in the bottom right, no one has masks on. Obviously, they're standing around as opposed to sitting down and what they're supposed to be doing and utilizing, the space. So I use that analogy very much so to say we need to continue. One bad actor in Connecticut, one restaurant that doesn't follow our guidelines. That's unfortunately what has happened a little bit in New Jersey. I use that as a big example, and making sure we are really policing each other. We're all in this together. For us to get to phase 3, we have to continue to follow phase 2 guidelines as best as we can. I know there's questions about, masks in the back of house and the health hazards and everything else. And trust me, I'm trying to make those same reasonings of why we should start to pull back some of the restrictions, but understand that these 2 photos, social media, the media play a big role in decisions that are made, unfortunately, at all of these states, but especially in Connecticut. And as we kind of look to kind of move forward with all of this, it's really, really important that I brought this slide up. I want you guys to kind of continue to talk. If you see something, obviously keep us posted to make sure that we are following the guidelines to the best of our ability. And we hopefully will continue to keep our curve flattened. We'll continue to keep case counts down. We can hopefully get into phase 3. There has been nothing, yet about phase 3 as far as bars have been taken away yet. But at the same time, it is something that the governor is looking at, and we're trying to have a lot of conversation. So start off with that slide, not really to scare anybody, but also to give you guys realistically the facts around what is happening around the country and my counterparts, and also what governors are doing and using their own social media, and their reasonings for making decisions sometimes aren't always based on metrics, which is a little bit frustrating. But I think I will just go back and commend and applaud everyone on this call. I think we've done a phenomenal job as an industry to follow these guidelines and prove to the governor and to prove to the residents of Connecticut that our restaurants and our industry can do the right thing, and will continue to do the right thing to keep employees and customers safe. And I'm looking forward to continuing that. I'm hoping we can stay on a course for phase 3 in mid-July and what that would look like. So that's the first slide. Just wanted to share that so you guys kind of knew what was going on with some of these photos, and if you guys follow some of the national media. All right. Wanted to give a little bit of a federal update from the National Restaurant Association. I had a call with them on Monday. A couple things that have happened. As you guys know, the PPP funding application process expired yesterday. I would hope everyone on this call received PPP funding either in the first round or in the second round. There is talk today about trying to extend that deadline beyond into August, because there is still money to be had if you didn't get a PPP loan. But I hope that's not the case. I hope everyone here has had a chance to apply for it and receive those funds. But also what happened since our last call is the PPP Flexibility Act did pass. I give a lot of credit to all of our delegates. Obviously, Senator Blumenthal and Senator Murphy did a really good job of carrying the flag for us about needing changes to PPP, especially for our industry specifically. So understand that the big part about this is what the Flexibility Act does. And there's a couple big caveats to this, because the SBA has been adding what we like to call the interim final rule, but it's like the 22nd version of a final rule. But they continue to add information actually to the benefit of you. So right now, the Flexibility Act, if you have your PPP loan, your 8-week cover period gets extended to 24 weeks. The 75 payroll to 25 utilities, rent, mortgage interest changes to 60/40, which will help a lot of you guys in a way with that to use that 40%. And then the safe harbor protection, that's actually been updated as of like late last week in their final rule. What that means is they've passed like a PPP easy form. So as you finish your cover period and work with your bank and you go to submit, hey, here's all the money I received, here's all the money I spent. It's a much easier process to get forgiven on the loan, as opposed to like the 10-page document that you would have to fill out and pretty much put everything on file. They passed a bill to allow part of this Flexibility Act to pass this easy form through the SBA with the support. And what they have in there is what's called safe harbor. And what that means is it goes back to the FTE discussion where, yes, if someone does not want to come back to work for you, but you have that in writing, you're protected. But also with the safe harbor language that's in there now is if you can prove, which we can all prove right now, that you are not back to normal, you still have restrictions, the state and legislators are still restricting you in your business, you can provide safe harbor and you don't have to get back to that FTE, and you should be able to get everything forgiven very easily. That's some great language in there. That's a huge part of this as you look to use your dollars and how, you're worried about how you get to certain FTEs, but within your covered period, I'd love to say inside the next, 16 weeks, we figure out a way to get back to normal. But I don't know if that's even really a reality, but the safe harbor protection is now in there. And I would urge you to talk with your bank, talk with your accountant. If you need any help, please reach out to us, but make sure you understand that and you're using the dollars, because I feel everyone that got a PPP should figure out a way to get it fully forgiven. There's not another program out there. There's the EIDL loans that are back open again. There is the bridge loans that some of you guys got, but all of those are loans. This is the one program that I know it's not an end-all be-all savior. I know it is a little bit of a Band-Aid, which I'll get into the second part of this, but please, any help we can provide. But this is a great passage of this Flexibility Act. I think it's going to do a lot to make it easier for our restaurants, and obviously as we get to the end of your covered period. Second part of this, I know people are already putting in comments. I guess they did extend it to August 8th if you haven't gotten a PPP, because there's still over $100 billion still in there. So thank you, Margaret and Jonathan. Additional asks from National. As you guys know, we talk about the Band-Aid of the PPP, what's going on across other states that are like Texas, Arizona, California, that are having to roll back their restrictions and their phases. That's playing a big factor into the talk about, even the president, I think yesterday, had said, we have to look at more funding and more help for the business community. There's a lot of things on the table. And I think we're trying to work through those with the help of the National Restaurant Association about our biggest ask and what we need. Obviously, the blueprint for recovery, which we've talked about before, is a little bit a part of this. Like a lot of the bullet points, there's about 4 or 5 things that are being talked about or being floated around. Obviously, there's the hospitality recovery fund, or the restaurant recovery fund. You guys probably have heard there's 2 different bills. There's a House bill and a Senate bill, the $120 billion. I'm not going to say right now, at least from what we're hearing, is they're probably not going to pass a bill specific to one industry. They want to make sure there's a lot of industries that have been hurt and are in dire straits, and they want to try to carve out a way to support them is kind of what's being talked about. However, those bills making it into bills onto the floor of the Senate and the floor of the House for discussion are helpful in those restaurant pieces. They're kind of a little bit different, but understand that National is working extremely hard to benefit all restaurants, not just independent restaurants on the IRC standpoint, but franchise owners and everything else, to make sure everyone has a chance to benefit from any additional round of funding. What also is being talked about is a possible second round of PPP, but the difference with the PPP loan is understanding that this second round of PPP would actually go to businesses that have to show loss, as opposed to the current PPP where it's any kind of business that fits the criteria could go get the money and use it for payroll. There's talk about the PPP program makes sense. It works. It's easy to fund. The SBA kind of, as opposed to starting some whole new program. That's a little bit of the talk that's going on in both the chambers down there in DC, as well as we've talked about tax credits in the PPE side of, if you're spending all this money, I continue to tell you guys to keep track of your PPE expenses, because there could be tax credits down the line. We're trying to work at the state level to give you guys support, because I know how expensive plexiglass is, gloves, masks, all of that can be. And then the last piece is that liability protection that, is talked about on a state level, and it's also talked about on a federal level. So those are kind of the 4 big asks right now that are on the table. There's some other talk about rent and lease and things like that could be helpful on the federal side. But so you guys know, I don't think anything, at least I'm taking the advice of National and Sean Kennedy, nothing's going to pass this week. And they go on recess for July 4th for the next 2 weeks. So realistically, it's going to be end of July, really early August before anything really gets done down there in DC. But we're going to continue to keep tabs and work with National to look at these additional asks and to see what support we might have to provide to our delegates to get them to help get things across the finish line. So that is the federal update that I have right now. And then I'll kind of give a little bit of a state update. I'll just kind of start with the Connecticut Restaurant Promise. Thank you. I think almost everybody here on this call has signed up for that. We created that infographic poster on the bottom left that you get mailed, as well as the window decal. I appreciate you guys putting it up on social and supporting and showcasing that you guys have taken the promise. I continue to urge all of you to do that on social. They've gotten some great responses, but again, we have to continue to educate the customer base about all the things you guys are doing to go above and beyond, above and beyond during this pandemic to keep them safe. So I just want to continue to highlight the promise, and anyone that continues to sign up, please know we will be mailing out more of those packets on a weekly basis. ServSafe, just an update here on ServSafe. Jennifer Conklin-Smith, who's on the call here, has been working tirelessly here with the ServSafe team about products, how we can host classes, how we can maybe get back to a little bit of normalcy of teaching classes in person. Obviously, there's those free ServSafe training videos, the reopening, takeout, and delivery. They're still there on our ServSafe part of our site, ctrestaurant.org/ServSafe. You can go to those links. You can have your employees use those for training. But then also on the manager training, we've gotten a lot of questions about that. We are still teaching classes where you can do it remotely, where you can watch the video and then you come into our Farmington office to take the class. We probably have, between 8 to 10 people a week that are coming in and taking a digital class online, a digital test, in person. They're learning from the class online. The second part about it too is we just talked with Eli's in Hamden, possibly utilizing their space, actually not possibly, but looking at the end of July and early August to have some in-person classes with Dennis and Nikki, who are kind of our two lead instructors. As you guys know, they almost lead the country. They have like a 92% passing rating if you go through their class and take their test. So we really want to get Nikki and Dennis back on board with us. So we're going to look at a date, I believe, late July, and a date in kind of the 2 weeks later in August there in Hamden, kind of middle part of the state. I appreciate Eli's for giving us that space. So if you go to our site, you'll learn about those classes. And if you want to sign people up to start getting them back, anybody that had prepared for a class that unfortunately did not happen, we're going to try to slot them in those times as well. We're going to try to keep those numbers about 25 for those first two classes, not go all the way up to our 35 yet. We have a big space down there at Eli's, but kind of keeping people safe. We're going to do box lunches. We're going to obviously follow all the protocol so everyone can feel safe. And Jennifer just put up July 27th and August 10th are those in-person classes. All right, so continuing to go through some slides before I get to Ryan. Updates to phase 2 guidelines. I sent this out in an email this week. Just want to make sure everyone is clear to some of the changes that have happened since phase 2 was launched on June 17th. Obviously, we finally got the DCD to update their guidelines on the bar seating barrier. I know there's a cost to this with plexiglass. I understand that, but please know that there's other states right now that haven't opened bars. And I had a long call with a couple media folks today, just really about this, bars aren't open. We pushed hard in phase 2 to make sure that you could use your bar seating for dining service. And not only can use it for dining service in bullet 1 and bullet 3, but you can also use it for a bartender to serve from behind the bar if you follow bullet 2, which means you can put a piece of plexiglass up that's 30 inches high from the bar, from the tabletop of the bar, and you could have an 8-inch gap at the bottom of it. So you could serve a beer, or you could serve a glass of, a drink as well as food, and the bartender can actually work. I know it's not ideal. I know it's a deterrent for some people. Doesn't feel right, doesn't feel the same, but please know that even Rhode Island, as they went to phase 3 this past day, yesterday, they still don't have this language in there yet. Bartenders aren't even able to work, and no one, you can't serve from behind the bar. And we have obviously some vendors that we can help you guys with looking at opportunities to build things. I know people have the mobile, kind of use my hands here, like portable plexiglass that can slide down the bar based on people go and sit. But I don't think that's going away anytime soon. Obviously, New York initially was removing the barriers in their guidance. And I can tell you right now, Cuomo is looking at tightening up those restrictions based on what they're seeing across the country, how to control kind of the bar side. So I just want to give you guys that option. I know it's not ideal, but please know early on, this was not in phase 2. Bars and any kind of bar seating was always in phase 3. So we're fortunate to get this language in there. I know some of you have already invested. Yes, there's people sitting at the bar. Is it the same? I don't think it is, but at the same time, it's another way for you to be able to use space inside your restaurant and your bar seating for dining service. So that's the bar seating update. That red language has been updated. Outdoor capacity has been updated. And what I mean by that is locations can now seat 50% of their indoor capacity. That hasn't changed. But what the commissioner has put in there now is 100% of their overall seating capacity outdoors. What that means is if you can expand your space, realistically following social distancing guidelines, you can pretty much go, if you had 100 inside and 50 outside prior to, that means you could do 150 outside and still do 50 inside. You could actually go above capacity if you could find that space. And it's obviously you need your town to approve it, and you got to follow those social distancing guidelines. I don't know how much this is going to impact everybody, but as I talk to folks, that look outside and they're like, well, I have a small space and I only have, 40 seats and I can't expand. And if I social distance really the tables, I get like 18, Scott. Well, things that you could be creative about is you could have an outdoor event out there of 35 and you don't have to social distance them. You could keep the tables closer together and use more of that patio space and generate more revenue because it is a party. You can have a party of 100 outside and you can have a party of 25 inside, and those rules, as long as they're seated at tables, could work. I actually had to call with someone last night to kind of talk through that. But obviously, a normal setting, you have to have the social distancing of tables. But as you expand to parking lots, as you expand to grass areas, understand that you don't have to go back and go, oh, it's 50% of what my outside is, or what is that actual capacity? It's actually 100% of what your overall pre-COVID times are. That kind of makes sense. I really wanted it to be no capacity limitations, but they really wanted to stick to this 100%. I know it's a little confusing. Question here on bar for outdoor private events. Understand standing service bars are still not allowed. Outdoor bar service similar to indoor with plexiglass and a service bartender, great. Go ahead. You can do that. Outdoor bar service with no bartender behind the bar and you're using it as a dining, like a high top table, you can do that as well. But to actually have bar service and people like that, use that New Jersey picture, but people walking up to the bar to grab a drink, that can't happen. Self-service and going up, not self-service, but service bars of a standing room is something that is not in phase 2. And we have to be very cautious of that. And I think that can open up a big, a big issue down the road of making sure that the bar, as you walk up to it, you're not walking up to grab a drink. You have to have the servers come to you to provide that food or that drink, as well as, or you're sitting at the bar and there's a plexiglass barrier and the bartender is serving it underneath. So understand that from an outdoor side as well as indoor. Tent walls. I've gotten a lot of questions about, oh my God, Scott, it's starting to rain, or there's wind gusts, or, can I put my tent walls down? Can I do that? We did get confirmation that yes, no, you cannot put all 4 tent walls down. However, you can put one down. So if you can, if you have a tent wall that you want to kind of put down to kind of block maybe sunlight or block wind or block rain, you can do that. But only one of those walls. You have to keep 3 open walls for what the DECD considers outdoor dining. But know that you can at least put one of the walls down where initially they were like no walls at all. So hopefully that's helpful for the tent wall question that we get a lot of. Hours of operation. Understand there was an executive order about outdoor activities back on May 12th. That was 9 p.m. Sunday through Thursday and 11 p.m. Friday and Saturday. What the DECD, and we've tried to get them to change this executive order, but understand that was outdoor activities. That doesn't define indoor. Your indoor should be normal operating hours. And realistically, I got confirmation from Commissioner Lehman. If you're looking to extend your hours beyond that, obviously it's summertime, a Thursday night, Wednesday night, they're putting it on the towns. Obviously if you expand areas, noise constraints, it's not so much of a health concern anymore. It's more about getting the town to approve you guys to have that outdoor space longer. But obviously I know most of your kitchens aren't open after 11, but I've seen some towns, I know in Greenwich, I just heard last night that they said, hey, we'll keep it at 11, but you can do 11 now outside, as opposed to that 9 o'clock because it is summer. So I would definitely recommend talking to your towns to say, hey, we're going to look to go back to at least as close to normal hours of our kitchen as possible because we want to try to generate as much revenue throughout the summer with indoor and outdoor dining. I hope those are, I guess, questions right now and answers to your questions. So, all right. I feel like I've spoken long enough, taking up about half of the time, but I know that those updates were important. And I'm happy to kind of answer questions that go along, but I'm going to, before I quickly turn over to Ryan, I do want to kind of update you guys from our side. And as I talk to national about how you manage COVID in the workplace, this is something that we've talked about as SRA CEOs across the country, state restaurant associations. We wanted to do this to kind of give you guys some updates as well. But the first thing you need to know too is testing sites, and understanding like where you can go to get tested, where your restaurant's located, what kind of testing you're trying to get. Obviously, you want it to be cost prohibitive. You want it to be free, which almost all the testing sites are, but please don't just walk up to, I've heard from some restaurateurs that, hey, we went to this site, we just tested people, but then I got a bill. And then like, oh, you can only get free testing here or here. And obviously on this next slide here, 211ct.org. The United Way is kind of running this. But if you go to that website and you kind of click at the top at COVID, you can, there's a whole link that says go find testing sites. There's over 147 sites right now across the state that you can go and get tested. But also the urgent care. I definitely highly recommend, like CVS has theirs in Hartford. You can find out rapidly how quickly, I think inside like an hour or 2 hours, they can tell you if you're positive or not. I think that's a huge benefit, obviously, within your business model. But understand that, look up these sites. You can kind of see, I use this as an example, like here on the Doc's urgent care and rapid testing in Waterbury. It says eligibility, all ages, individuals with or without symptoms, but all individuals must complete a telemed evaluation. So that's not easy. That you can't just go there with your team and get that. You'd have to get a telemed with your primary care. So you need to make sure you go through this and try to find those sites where your restaurant is. And I would reach out to them and give them a call, say, hey, if I ever had to bring anybody, what do I need to provide? Do I need to have them have their primary care insurance card? What if they don't have that? Like, trying to give you guys some insight that I would start to prepare that now with your managers and your team. If you had to send yourself or send anybody to get testing, knowing what your resources are. I couldn't put everything on here. I really wanted to get to this site to show you guys that United Way is doing a really good job on those testing facilities, but understanding that the conversation communication, you should start now, not wait till, oh my God, there could potentially be someone that has it. What do I do? You should be having these conversations with your team. And then the last thing before I do turn it over to Ryan, what I've seen is I think you guys do a really great job. It is your family, your staff. You should have that initial conversation with your staff to kind of talk through, make them feel more comfortable, make them understand that you are behind them. There's protections for you as an employer with the CARES Act that passed. If someone was sick and they had to go home, yes, I know you have to pay them, but you would get that back down the road. But understand that a lot of people are like, oh, I don't know if I got sick and I had to go home, I'm not going to get paid, or I'm not going to get taken care of. Like I tell you right now that those initial conversations and easing that burden are huge for you building that trust and that relationship with your staff, of knowing where you are as an employer, where your protections lie, but also where they are. And I've seen that. I've seen a lot of you guys do this as best practices, but I lead with that for Ryan to kind of go through really the proper procedure. But it really starts with you and setting the tone for your staff and understanding and taking those proper steps of, hey, we need to protect our business, obviously, but we want to protect you as well. And we're going to do all these things to make sure, we keep you safe, and we keep, the rest of our team safe as well. So, Ryan O'Donnell, our legal counsel. So Ryan, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. And before we get going on this, I just want to let everybody know, I really appreciate everything that the CRA is doing. They're doing a fantastic job. They are such a tremendous resource for restaurant owners. They make my job easier, which I appreciate. And I feel very strong. We're telling clients to go look at the information that the CRA puts out there. It's really a great resource. So, if you have questions, the CRA probably has the answers. Let me see here. I just want to, Scott, how do I flip the slides on this? There we go. Thank you. All right, guys. So if we're talking about what to do when we have a COVID positive employee in the workplace, and the first step, which seems obvious, but I can promise you the experience I've had over the last few months, it's not as obvious as it should be, is immediately send the employee home. And one of the issues with that, what Scott touched on, is there's a lot of concern about, the employees wanting to come forward with the information, or perhaps trying to conceal the symptoms or the fact that they have had a positive test because they are scared about their livelihood, how are they going to make rent, how are they going to pay the bills. And I think the first thing that we need to do as employers is to remind them that, we've got their back, right? And that they are covered under the CARES Act if they're unable to come to work because of COVID, and provide them with the appropriate benefit information. Let them know that there's resources to help, and that they're not going to be dealing with this on their own, and that having COVID is not going to cost them their job. I think it's really important to reassure them, like Scott noted, right off the bat, right? So that the entire rest of the process goes much smoother if you have an employee who feels reassured and understands that they're not going to get punished for having COVID. So once you sort of get past that initial conversation, right? You now have to determine, well, what's the potential scope or what's the scope of this exposure, right? And you can start to figure that out by asking questions. And you're going to ask questions of the employee who's positive, but you're also going to ask questions of your managers and other folks who have, people who you work with, people who are paying attention to what's going on in the restaurant, your GMs. You can even ask other staff. So the first thing that you want to do is figure out, when's the last time this individual was at the restaurant, right? If they haven't been in for 10 days, then there's a lot less to worry about. If they were in the day before, then you're going to have some different issues. You're going to want to know, what other employees did they have direct contact with, right? It's not just were they in the restaurant, right? It's who did they interact with, and how long and how significant was that interaction. If it was, they walked past each other, they're 6-10 feet apart, they wave, they acknowledge each other, that's not really a significant interaction. However, if there's close physical proximity, if they're shaking hands, handling the same equipment, if they're working in the same stations, working at the same tables, those are issues, right? Those are going to increase the likelihood that there may have been some transmission. And then, also, have there been any other notable interactions between the COVID positive employee and others, whether it's vendors? If there was, it's unlikely there's been significant interaction with a customer, but it is worthwhile to ask, in case they did have any physical contact with a customer. I'm not really sure how that would happen or why it would happen, but it doesn't hurt to ask. So after you've gone through all those questions, right, now you're going to use those answers to determine which employees, if any, may have been exposed. And you might not have an issue, right? But most likely there is going to be several employees who've been exposed, and you want to create the list based off of those questions and then review it with your managers to make sure that it's accurate, right? Everybody goes back through it, agrees that, okay, these are the people who have likely been or who are in the category of possible exposure for COVID based on this one individual testing positive. And then we're going to go on to step 4, which is contacting each of these potential exposures. And then you're going to explain the following, right? Now you have to handle this delicately. You're going to let them know that they've been in direct contact with an individual who tested positive for COVID-19. You don't have to, and you shouldn't identify the individual with the positive COVID test, right? The name of the person doesn't matter because we've already determined that they've been in direct contact with this individual. So you're going to tell them that they've been exposed, right? Now you're going to review the COVID symptoms list with these individuals and ask them if they're experiencing any symptoms. I'm not asking you guys to play doctor, right? I recognize that we're not medical professionals, but you can just go down the symptoms list with them to start figuring out if maybe they've already begun to manifest symptoms, and then give them the information about symptoms and testing information, right? We want them to go get tested as soon as possible. And most folks we're finding are very amenable to testing. There's not a lot of pushback. Everybody wants to get tested. And so as part of that, you're going to now require all employees who've been in direct contact with the COVID positive individual to test negative before returning to work. We're going to have that positive test before you can come back to work, unless they're going to go with the symptoms route, which could keep them out longer, right? If they refuse to take a test, then they have to self-quarantine for 14 days. However, if they're still experiencing symptoms at the end of 14 days, it's not an automatic return to work, right? They still have to be clear of symptoms. Like they can't come back to work on the 15th day if they still have a fever, right? So that's important, right? It's 14 days and the absence of symptoms, not just 14 days. So obviously the biggest question that we're having is how do folks return to work, right? When we have a COVID positive individual and they're experiencing symptoms, right? So we have to break it down here. You've tested positive and they're experiencing symptoms, right? So persons with COVID-19 who have symptoms and who were directed to care for themselves at home may discontinue isolation. This is all from the CDC, right? They can discontinue isolation if at least 3 days have passed since recovery, which is defined as the end of the fever without medication and improvement in the respiratory symptoms. And 10 days have passed since symptoms first appeared, right? And then if you're going with a testing-based strategy, and you can work this out however, as is best fits your restaurant, right? Best fits your business model. That persons with COVID-19 who have symptoms, if they decide to go with the testing-based strategy, they have to have a negative test result, right? A resolution of fever and improvement in respiratory symptoms, but you want 2 test results, not just 1, if they're going only with the test-based strategy. And it's certain kind of tests that the links that Scott provided earlier are the kind of tests that we want. But it shouldn't just be, the guy on the street corner who's doing a free COVID test, right? You want to make sure that we're sending them to a legitimate testing facility that does the exact types of tests that we're looking for. Oh, can we go back one, Scott, please? Perfect, thank you. So now, what if they're tested positive for COVID-19, but they're not experiencing symptoms, right? So the CDC breaks this down to a separate category, right? You have COVID positive test with symptoms. Now we also have COVID positive test without symptoms. So you can go with 2 approaches. You can go with a time-based strategy, which is persons with the laboratory confirmed COVID-19 who have not had symptoms and were directed to care for themselves may discontinue isolation, i.e. come back to work under the following conditions, right? 10 days have passed since the day of their first positive COVID-19 diagnostic test, assuming they have not subsequently developed symptoms since the positive test. If they develop symptoms, then the symptom-based or test-based strategy should be used, right? So we're only going to use this approach if 10 days have passed since the positive test and they're still not showing symptoms, right? So they can come back to work after 10 days of a positive test if they're not showing symptoms. And this is a very rare instance that you're going to have this, but we have had younger people be asymptomatic carriers. So that's generally what we're talking about here. Now, if a person who's tested positive hasn't had any symptoms, right, they can discontinue isolation on a test-based strategy as well, right? And that's because, so that's when you're going to go with 2 tests back-to-back in less than 24 hours that both come back negative. Now, the CDC put out a warning based on this approach, so I wouldn't recommend this approach, just sort of quickly test and get back to work if you have no symptoms, because and as the CDC notes, just because you don't have the symptoms, it's hard to tell where you are in the process, and it's much more of a gray area at that point. So I recommend, if you've got a positive COVID test with no symptoms, stick with a time-based strategy. That's hands down the safest. safest route to go, and you're much less likely to experience a false, having a sick employee return to work just because they think they've been, because we have seen some of the testing come back with false results. So I think it's just a little bit dicey. You're better off sticking with a time-based quarantine strategy. So again, there's the CDC is being very cautious in its recommendations here. And it acknowledges that, that some of these recommendations appear to conflict with recommendations on when to discontinue quarantine for people who have known to have been exposed to COVID-19. And the reason for that is because CDC recommends 14 days of quarantine after exposure based on the time it takes to develop illness if infected, right? Thus, it's possible that a person known to be infected could leave isolation earlier than a person who's quarantined because they're possibly infected. And so just to clarify what the CDC is saying there, it's okay. You don't know, just because you've been exposed, the virus may not have developed in you yet, right? Whereas if you test positive, then they know that you have it. And the idea being that it could take a period of time after exposure to develop the illness. Whereas once you have the illness, the timelines are more definitive. So the CDC is just wanting to clarify that there is a difference between exposure and infection, and they just want employers to be very cautious about that and not confuse those two issues, even though they are on their face pretty damn confusing. So, but they're trying to kind of provide pathways through this and options for employers to handle these based on their own unique business circumstances.
All right, Ryan, I have some questions before I think we go down the side of the chat.
Sure.
I was kind of listening to kind of talk, and some of the questions I get is, okay, I had a positive test. Do I have to shut down my entire business for 14 days now? Right. What are the rules, or from best practice from your side, or what you're seeing? Sure. What do you suggest? And obviously, the steps they should take.
There's no need to shut down things right now if you have that situation. I think if there's a specific area in terms of best practices, if there's a specific area within the restaurant where the person who tested positive was working primarily, maybe you shut that down and clean it. Like if there's a back section where the person was working, perhaps you have people sit up front while you clean that section. There's certainly no legal requirement to shut down right now if you have a positive exposure, or if you have an employee who tests positive. Again, strong, the CDC has put out a lot of guidelines about, which cleaning products to use, and you always want to follow best practices to make sure that you're using because not every cleaning product is sufficient to kill COVID. So, you can't just take like a damp cloth and some soap and rub it down. You have to use these products that are specifically designed to kill COVID. So I think the only area that you could get jammed up is if you knew you had an exposure or a positive test, and then you basically just use a damp cloth and some, and a bucket to kind of wash it down like you would if something spilled. You want to make sure that you have the right cleaning products in there. But as long as you're taking care of it with the cleaning products, you do not need to shut down.
No, thanks, Ryan. Yeah. And obviously I didn't put the link up here, but CDC does have, which we can put up on our website. They have a link that defines restaurants and bars and best practices, to Ryan's point about cleaning the isolation area, the areas that you want to try to wait a little bit to disinfect or not send somebody in. Their recommendation doesn't mean you have to do it. We wait 24 hours before you send somebody in to clean it. Hypothetically, they could get sick. There's definitely and it changes by the day or by the hour, but I know a lot of conversations I have with many of you about like, oh, if I shut down for 2 weeks, and then it happens again and I shut down again for and that's very clear. This is not, you're not alone in these conversations. And that's why I continue to reach out to Ryan. I highly suggest, and I have his contact information or us to kind of help you, guide you through this. but know that every business, not just restaurants, are dealing with this. But understanding is, the biggest thing is to really try to get ahead of it. Think of it, if it does happen, you're getting that person that is a positive test out of the situation, quarantining them, and protecting the rest of your staff and managing that process. Because obviously your business cannot survive of shutting down for 2 weeks, coming back, happening again, shutting down for another 2 weeks. Like, we know that that's physically not possible. And that's really why we try to work these guidelines about how it really starts at the beginning of the process, knowing all the proper procedures and keeping everyone as safe as you possibly can. Obviously that's almost impossible. We understand that, but we hope these kind of guidelines continue to make it a little better. All right. Another question for you, Ryan, is about a negative. Do you need to require, what do you ask to require if do you need someone to provide you a negative test? Can you require that, or to get them to come back? What's your, because I don't think you can, but what are the best practices that you see and making sure people are safe and protecting you as a business to bring them back?
So you cannot make them provide you with a positive test result or the negative test result. You can, you ask them, you certainly hope they're being honest with you. Now, a way to avoid that is if you simply have the full quarantine period for someone who tested positive, then you can avoid, if they refuse to show you a positive, they can show you the positive test, right? And so you can satisfy the testing requirements if they so choose, right? If they want to come back to work sooner and they want to get you those tests, great. However, if they're not willing to do that, or it's not something that you're comfortable doing, then you can just have the time-based or symptom-based approach where they can be out for the 14 days and until their symptoms have had the reductions that we talked about earlier. Obviously, a test is the fastest way to get back. It does come with some possible drawbacks of the false testing result, which we have seen in some cases. But so, Scott, to answer your question more directly, no, you can't ask for it. But if the employee wants to provide it, it is certainly a way to get back to work faster.
Thanks, Ryan. And I know you mentioned, we talked at length about these different issues, but you can't, from a doctor's note standpoint, things like that in normal times, which I think could still fall into this criteria now. If someone's like, hey, I'm never going to get tested, I had a fever, you send them home and they're like, it was just a fever. It wasn't, but like, you could still mandate, just like in normal times, a doctor's note to get clear, but before they come back, because obviously I've known some people that have gotten sick during this time that didn't get COVID, but how you manage that. So is that still a request that you can make, of your employees?
Absolutely. If somebody goes out and they're out for a couple of days with fever, stomach ache, they're saying that they don't want to go get tested, but they're insisting that they don't have COVID, I would say, just like any other illness, that you would be dealing with, you say, look, you've been out for a couple of days. We need you to have a doctor's note before you come back. The doctor's note does not have to give specifications or details about what issues that individual is dealing with, just that in the doctor's opinion, they're cleared to come back to work. That takes the negligence or the liability, I should say, off of your platter and puts it right on the doctor. So if the doctor certifies that someone's able to come back to work and they turn out that they do have COVID, that's not a great situation. You've done what you need to do to protect yourself, as opposed to just taking their word for it. So I think it's important to have that letter if they've been out for a period of time. Again, the letter doesn't have to be specific about what they're dealing with, just that they're cleared to come back to work.
No, perfect. Thank you, Ryan. Other kind of just, we obviously, going back to filing again. See, I feel like I'm back at my webinar. So would you keep that in the confidential medical file? Go back to what files to put this stuff in and information?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott. Handle it like you would any other medical information that you receive from the employee, not in the personnel file. Put it in the separate medical file. And again, you just treat it like you would any other illness if it's not specific to COVID, right? I mean, it could be COVID, it could not. But if this person is not willing to get a test, then there's nothing wrong with asking for that doctor's note. Again, not saying that they, not test specific information, but just that in the doctor's opinion, they're cleared to come back to work.
Sure. Another question that I see here. That's answering a lot of questions actually already, so it's good. And this, Ryan, I mean, obviously we've talked at length at this, and I think we go back to, obviously, this presentation is it's about preparing and planning. And, you probably should have already be doing these steps, but at the same time, kind of where we stand right now, and making sure you've got the proper protocol, for your team and everything else. And I also, what I've seen, kind of going back to, you can't mandate anybody to test, but what I've seen from the restaurateurs that have done it very, very well, and actually I know many that have had to deal with this situation within their restaurants through this process, unfortunately. But where I see the ones that have done the best job, it goes back to, having the conversation with your staff initially, talking about it, kind of getting things out in the open, talking about protections, talking about we're here for you. Also saying, listen, like, it's not going to cost you anything. We have free testing opportunities, whether, we can get you there, or we'll take you, or I'm going to go myself. Because at the end of the day, they need to realize it's not just about their own safety. It's about the safety of their employees and their peers, or the people they're going home to. And I think when you share it that way, and I think have that conversation ahead of time, I haven't seen a lot of pushback of people like, I'm not getting tested, I don't have it. I think that's why I think those conversations initially really have to start at that core of, we're in this together. We want to make sure this restaurant survives and there's jobs for you to come back to. We don't have to shut this whole thing down. So if there is an issue that comes up and we just suspect and we want to be safe, even if we all go get tested, which I've seen, and everyone comes back negative, it's just a breath of fresh air to say, hey, okay, it wasn't that. It might've been a scare, but it wasn't. We can kind of move forward. But I do think it goes back to the core of the conversation that you're continuing to be a leader, as you guys all are as restaurateurs, the men and women of saying, hey, we need to make sure we're protecting our family and our staff. Like that's what they are. So I think to this, it is that proactive side. I don't know if that answered that question. And if there's other questions, people can kind of jump in here. But I think the slides that Ryan's kind of provided is very important. Obviously the CDC is kind of changing, every single day about, what it means to, as they learn more about the virus, as they learn more about asymptomatic versus people that are sick versus how you can get it. I mean, there's still so much to be learned with this virus, but obviously taking these proper protocols. So do businesses need mandatory testing for their staff? The answer, Fred, is no. There's no mandatory testing by any means through that process. It's a recommendation of looking at it. This is actually going to be my next question to Ryan, not to put him on the spot. The travel restrictions, Ryan, and I know as we get to this with businesses, and I think there's 17 states now that our governor has said they must quarantine for 14 days. And I think that you need to share that information with your staff. And Ryan, you can jump in too, but I would say, I can provide that list of all those states. It's mainly southeastern and southern part of the country. But let's say you have an employee that's like, hey, I'm driving down to Florida, for a week, and I'll be back and I'll come back to work. Unfortunately, right now that can't happen. They leave the state and they go into one of those states and come back, and willingly that they did that, they would have to quarantine. They have to follow those rules. And the risk, I guess that goes back to, the risk should not be worth the reward of a short term. Like, even if, like, I think Ryan and I talked about this yesterday, like, is it worth like saying, oh, well, they're not going to go get tested, but I think they're fine, I'm just going to bring them back in 3 or 4 days, I don't think it was COVID. And then all of a sudden you get more people sick, and now it becomes a much bigger issue because, you didn't really follow those protocol that you probably should. And you kind of pushed an employee to say, hey, just stay home for 10 to 14 days. It's in your best interest. And it's you as a business, it's in your best interest, obviously, for the long term. And I think that that kind of goes back to the 14-day quarantine piece of, you should lead with a conversation right now, making sure your staff know it. Someone just goes, hey, I'm going to South Carolina to go see my mom. Like, they need to know, hey, if you come back, the moment you come back, you got to be in your house for 14 days. You can't work. I can't pay you. You're making that on your own decision. Like, so the moment you come back, let me know. And then, yeah, of course, I'll let you back to work on that 14th to 15th day. They need to understand that right now. And I know it's hard. I mean, I was supposed to go visit my family in Florida, my parents, next week. I'm not. And obviously they're not coming up here, but it's a difficult situation, difficult time. But I think that your staff need to understand the repercussions of what's going on around the country as well.
Hey Scott, this is actually a good topic of conversation. I've had this issue come up with a few folks. So with the new quarantine with the 16 states now, in theory, they're being quarantined under a governmental order, even though it's a self-quarantine though, right? So it's not a mandated quarantine, it's a self-quarantine. How does that affect the CARES Act? From my perspective, because it's not a mandatory quarantine, you're being told to self-quarantine, the CARES Act would not apply.
Yeah. And also you're not mandating them to go to those states either and come back.
Right. I mean, they're basically being negligent. I would argue that we've been told this in advance, right? Now, if somebody has gone away beforehand, I still think, look, you have to be quarantined. Even if you come back after it's already started, maybe the CARES Act would apply there. But I think at the end of the day, I think the governor was very clear in how they chose to use what language they decided to use here. And it's a self-quarantine. It's not a mandatory quarantine. So I think the CARES Act does not cover you if you've voluntarily gone to one of these states.
And you literally almost answered the question Denise just asked about if someone came 2 days before. But again, I think the concern there, and obviously Denise, it's the business decision, and that's a hard decision because realistically they might not have known and how you want to manage that as a business to that employee. But you got to also weigh the risk of your business right now, is to say, what, like they probably didn't get it. They're in this part of the state. I can bring them back. They could be asymptomatic. Like it's difficult. And I think that, to Ryan's point, we're going to try to answer, but as every answer to one question comes with 30 questions on the back end of it and how we manage the process. But obviously, the FMLA, the question, I've seen a couple questions about, do they have to work for you 30 days prior? Yes, it's kind of in that side. So if you hired someone brand new, there is some concerns with that of how you could have them go out on FMLA and manage that process. And obviously we'll try to get some more answers on that CARES Act language. I know Jill asked a great question, about over 500 employees. If you have a larger business, I thought there was a carve out based on, individual kind of LLCs, or at least the restaurants, of what falls under the 500, but Jill will try to get that answer to your question. Some people just asked about, you mentioned, I get the money back in the CARES Act. I would reach out to your accountant now about that process, because there's ways to use dollars initially and use it as tax credits down the road and say, hey, I'm going to, not have to pay certain taxes, but I can prove that I use this in this FMLA reasoning. And then when you go to do your taxes later on, so they're trying to find ways where it's like, hey, I have to now spend $1,500 for the next 2 weeks or $5,000 on somebody, where am I getting that money? I'm not going to get it till a credit. So the federal government is looking for ways, but obviously your accountant's got to do a little bit of work, and we can kind of help you if you don't have that, to try to work through that process, because every situation is different. As we move forward, and it's hard. And obviously, keeping tabs, and that's really what our job is, and trying to provide you guys resources. Why I think, this call is so important as well, is making sure we're providing you guys at least the most up-to-date information that we have. I think Ryan and his entire team at Siegel, Connor, O'Donnell, and Beck has been phenomenal throughout my time in this role in 2 years, but obviously even more so during the pandemic, of helping each of you guys through this process. I want to be firm to kind of our time. I know we started 5 minutes late, so it's getting close to the hour. Obviously want to put out our email addresses that are here. My staff with Yvette, Jennifer, and Emily, obviously Nicole with our lobbyist. And, Ryan's email is on there to make sure if you've got specific questions that we didn't answer today, we want to make sure we try to get those answers to you. Please feel free to shoot me a note as well, and I'll try to get some specific answers that were asked through the call. While we were on the call, breaking news, I guess, and this is kind of what's kind of going on around our country, but Mayor de Blasio in New York City just postponed indoor dining in phase 3 in New York City. As of 21 minutes ago, hitting my news feed on my phone. Again, and his reasoning is because of the spikes other parts of the country, and he doesn't feel comfortable going indoor, almost similar to quotes about Murphy. That does not affect the entire state of New York yet in that phase 3, but Obviously, New York City, as you guys know, was the hardest hit area of our country, and kind of he's using that as reasonings not to get to indoor, which is going to be a huge blow.
Night setbacks for President.
Oh, someone sounds like they're listening to the news right now. Putting it on. So understand though too, I mean, obviously I feel for New York City and Adam, the head of the alliance down there, because they don't have a lot of outdoor dining. I mean, there's no room in New York City to have that. It's very limited. So, you know, they're continuing to get hit hard. Obviously talk with New Jersey's head and Mary Lou and how hard it is for them, for a couple bad actors that are kind of doing what's wrong. We are leading the country outside of Rhode Island and proving that our restaurants can be open, and knock on wood, our numbers can continue to stay flat. But again, please do not, don't take that lightly. I know people start to get comfortable walking around, wanting to take their mask off. You got people that always come out, and you kind of put your employees and your servers and bartenders, even yourselves, in difficult situations of feeling uncomfortable. But I mean, really setting the tone from the beginning is so important through this process. I use those two photos at the beginning of this presentation, you know, because one of us that goes steps outside the line and just decides, oh, it's not really a bad virus. We haven't had the cases. Like you guys can see right now that governors and legislative leaders and mayors are making decisions based on what they see in the media, not so much on metrics. And it's very frustrating, you know, to hear this news and everything else. But the good thing is we will continue in my role to continue to talk through with our governor, his team, Commissioner Lehman and others, to make sure that you know, they understand the repercussions of them. Fortunate, I said this to a lot of folks, we got to phase 2 with indoor dining opening, and now we're 2 weeks in and nothing spiked. But like, you know, I felt like what happened in New Jersey is they were 2 days away and something happened, and they just, now they're on pause for a time period. But I wanted to share that with you guys because it is difficult. We'll probably have another webinar once phase 3 guidelines come out and the data is set. But I hope that this call was helpful, provided some information for you guys as you lead into the weekend. I wish all of you guys the best on July 4th. Continue to stay safe. Continue to be leaders as you are, and in your restaurants. I wish you all the best, and I look forward to talking to many of you guys soon. And Ryan, thank you again for your time, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, everybody.